Okay, I'm really happy to introduce Frederica Bowcutt to you for the talk today. She teaches botany in interdisciplinary programs here at the college. She's been a member of the faculty since 1996, specializing in floristics, field plant ecology, and plant-centric environmental history. The talk she's giving today is drawn from her book, The Tan Oak Tree and Environmental History of a Pacific Coast Hardwood. We do have copies of this book available in the mezzanine after the lecture if you're interested and you'd like to purchase your very own copy and then track Frederica down to get her to sign it. It's a beautiful book. I have a copy. It's a really beautiful book. She's also published multiple floras on state parks in the North Coast Range and Central Valley of California, and her essays have appeared in a variety of journals. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's from the University of California, Davis, both in botany. And before earning her PhD in ecology from University of California at Davis, she worked for 5 years as an ecologist for the California Department of Parks and Recreation. And she's also worked as an environmental consultant doing rare plant surveys and ecological restoration. I'd also like to add that she's an artist in her own right, does really beautiful botanical illustrations, and her program, Picturing Plants, this spring will involve her expertise in botanical illustration as well as a couple of visitors. So that's a program to look forward to if you're interested in that field. Please help me in welcoming Frederica.
Try to get rid of the barn that's up at the top.
Oh, okay.
We need to go into a more.
So I want to just start by thanking my friend and colleague Ruth Hayes for all the tireless work that she and others have done to organize this lecture series, the Anthropocene Consortium lecture series. I also want to thank the Evergreen State College Foundation for generously supporting my tan oak research through grants and summer institutes. And lastly, for nearly 20 years, I have cultivated my skills as an interdisciplinary scholar through the experience of teaching with 21 different faculty members here at Evergreen in interdisciplinary team-taught programs. I've taught with American historians, geographers, a folklorist, artists, including Ruth, political economists, and these experiences were critical to me in developing and completing the book on tan oak. So I want to thank my colleagues. So I want to start by making the connection to the theme of this lecture series. And really kind of at core, what I want to say is that climate change is is linked to many other environmental challenges that we're being faced with that are linked to the activities of humans on this planet. And I think many of you are aware that this summer, for example, we were faced with some serious consequences of the drought that has struck California in terms of high wildfire risk. However, climate change links with other human impacts like the introduction of non-native species, including pathogens, plant pathogens. And these synergistic relationships between climate change and biological invasions can result in a bad situation becoming even worse. And certainly that is the case in this case study with tan oak that I want to focus on today. Part of the challenge is then further exacerbated by the fact that we are living in a time period where free trade is emphasized in the form of the current form of capitalism that sort of dominates on the planet. And so as a result, the sort of insufficient regulated trade externalizes these environmental costs of doing business and poses a threat to even common species like tan oak. So I want to begin by reading a couple of paragraphs from my book to introduce you to this plant, which is also known as the beautiful tree. And so I'm going to start on page 7. In the Kashaya Pomo language, tan oak is called kishkale, which translates to beautiful tree. In his 1889 description of tan oak, the first botany professor at the University of California, Berkeley, Edward L. Green, called tan oak the most remarkable of all North American oaks and listed it among the most beautiful of California forest trees. One booster of tan oak as a source of fine-grained wood claimed in 1891 that it is not generally known that this is one of the most beautiful of all the hardwoods of America, or for that matter, of any other country. In his multi-volume treatise, The Silva of North America, Charles Sprague Sargent ranked it among the most interesting inhabitants of U.S. forests in 1895. He claimed that no other Western North American oak trees surpassed the best representatives of tan oak in massive beauty, in symmetry of outline, or in richness of color. Sargent described how in early spring the elongated tender shoots and unfolding leaves coated with bright hairs, appearing like masses of flowers against the dark background of foliage, light up the dark coniferous forest where it often grows. One late 19th century writer for a San Francisco newspaper compared old-growth tan oak groves in Mendocino County to druidic temples because of their lofty branches and pleasing forms, a romantic reference to the lost sacred oak groves used in the ancient Celtic religion of the British Isles and Europe. George Sudworth, a nationally recognized tree authority who worked for the U.S. Forest Service for more than 4 decades, remarked in 1908, economically, a tree of the greatest importance in Pacific forests, both for its valuable tan bark and for the promise it gives of furnishing good commercial timber in a region particularly lacking in hardwoods. Yet despite high praise, most Americans remain unfamiliar with this common associate in the coast redwood forests of the United States. So why should we care? So just a kind of quick rundown of some of the challenges that face tan oak today. Fire suppression is certainly a big one. Herbicide use in industrial forests that favor Douglas fir, and control for competitors like our native hardwoods, including red alder, bigleaf maple, and tan oak. But sudden oak death, which is a non-native disease caused by Phytophthora ramorum, is a very significant threat and could actually is already resulting in significant changes in forest structure and function. And it is that spread of that disease organism, that pathogen, Phytophthora ramorum, which I may in my talk also refer to as P. ramorum. So the pathogen is what causes sudden oak death, and there are relationships with climate change that make this introduction of this non-native pathogen more problematic. So tan oak is a climatic relic like coast redwood is. It's a species that was more widespread in the past during a regime where on the West Coast the climate was more tropical or semi-tropical, it was warmer and wetter, and it's been sort of forced to the edge of the continent like coast redwood. Although it currently does not have a lot of commercial value, it's important commercially because it, in its ecological functions, helps to reduce the threat of pathogens for commercially important species like Douglas fir. It also produces an enormous amount of acorns, which are important for numerous wildlife species as well as people. and I will be talking about all of these in more detail. It's also one of the most common hardwoods in California. So I want to begin. My talk is roughly organized in the way that the book is organized. So I want to begin with tan oak in terms of its production of edible nuts. The reproductive output of these trees can be enormous. The Forest Service actually measured one individual tree producing as many as 1,000 pounds of acorns. Many species, as I mentioned, depend on these nuts. In some systems, they are the primary food source for wildlife species that span mammals, birds, and there are also they also provide habitat for other organisms like salamanders and their dead and decaying woody debris. These acorns were the basis of an indigenous acorn economy that was widespread in California and included many different species of oaks. I want to mention that the tan oak is the only species in its genus, Notholithocarpus. Densiflorus is its scientific name. It is not in the genus Quercus, which is what all the other species of oak are in. So it's a monospecific genus, meaning that it only has one species in the genus on the planet. However, they have acorns that look and are as edible as the sometimes called true oaks, a very Eurocentric moniker for species in Quercus, because Notholithocarpus is only found in North America. Quercus is found in Eurasia and in North America. But these acorns from Quercus and from Notholithocarpus formed this expansive acorn economy that was significantly disrupted by the introduction of industrial capitalism in the West and white settlement. In this image, you can see in the center, actually, some granaries or acorneries. I don't know what you would call that. That's not really granaries, but they're called granaries. In the Yosemite Valley. And these particular structures were probably being used to store the acorns of the black oak. But the technology for processing these acorns was well developed in California and involved leaching the nuts, pounding them into a meal, and then leaching them to remove the tannic acid from the nut meal to make them more palatable and also to make them more nutritious. It's this dependence on oak acorns in California, and in this case, these particular tribes, the Hoopa, Karuk, and the Yurok, particularly favored tan oak. Tan oak has a large nut. It's quite sweet once it's been processed, and it can be very productive and is typically less likely to fail to produce a crop in a single year. Quercus typically will produce a lot, and then the next year they may not produce a lot, and then a couple of years down the road they'll produce a lot again. This is called masting. It's an adaptation to prevent its herbivores, the animals that depend on the nuts, to build up their populations and compete with native people for this food. So tan oak was a favored and continues to be a favored source of plant food among many tribes in California, particularly in Northern California, like these tribes, the Hoopa and the Karuk and the Yurok. And their material culture reflects this dependency. This is a bowl that was used for serving acorn porridge. One of the reasons why I got interested in this plant was pretty early on, it became evident to me that there were many biologists that spoke of its praises, its admirable qualities, and that they didn't have much sway on the direction that tan oak use went. And I think this is an example of that. C. Hart Merriam, an important biologist of his time, recognizing the value of this food for human beings. Part of what I want to say in this talk and convey to you is just the importance of understanding these complex environmental problems in a historical context. So I think part of the reason why people like Miriam didn't have a lot of impact was the influence of cultural values, religious ideologies that very much shaped the attitudes and worldview of Euro-American settlers. These are images from another place and another time, but the concepts were transplanted to North America with Euro-Americans. So on the far left, you see an image from a manuscript. This is a handmade book from the roughly the 15th century in Europe. And what it shows is primitive Europeans knocking acorn nuts out of some species of quercus and subsisting on this. And what the image is communicating to the reader is that this is primitive, and that a more advanced people will depend on a grain, on wheat. So in the far right-hand corner, you see Virgo presiding the time of the harvest for a grain, easy to store, easy to modify. So this still is true today, right? Wheat can be modified to be savory, you can add sugar, you can add salt, you can add fat, and many sort of fast foods and not so healthy foods depend on the sort of versatility of wheat and the capacity to store it for long periods of time. Acorns in Europe during this time period were predominantly used to fatten pigs before the slaughter in fall and early winter. And this fact is reflected in agricultural calendars in these handmade books, including prayer books from the early modern era from Europe. So here again, we see Europeans knocking acorns out of some species of quercus to feed pigs so that you can fatten them up before you kill them and salt them for storage during the winter months. What happened when Euro-Americans settled in the West is that they arrived in a location where that's interesting. I think a bunch of slides disappeared. They arrived in a location that had already been manipulated to favor tan oaks. And that management regime was through the use of fire. And so what happened was they repurposed a landscape that had been burned by native people to favor this tree, tan oak. And instead of native people continuing to harvest from these trees, they were displaced, and hogs were introduced into these systems to use these cultural landscapes in a very, very different way. So you can see here in 1881 that in Humboldt County in Northern California, one particular industry company, Humboldt Pork Packing Company, sold more than 400,000 pounds of pork by 1881. This is really early in white settlement, in the history of white settlement. So here's another scientist who I thought, so he was hired by the Forest Service in the early 20th century to do a study of tan oak. And he, I think, very wisely recognized already in the early 1900s that Native people were manipulating vegetation on a landscape scale. And this comes up in his various books. Willis Lynn Jepson is often called the father of botany, California botany. He was a professor for many, many years at UC Berkeley, my alma mater, and he wrote a number of books, including The Trees of California, and I will quote him actually several times in my talk. So the evidence for this burning practice comes from multiple sources. One of the sources is from the microfossil record, meaning pollen and phytoliths, which I'll get to in a minute here. It's also embedded in the historical record, which I just offered one piece of evidence in support of this with the quote from Jepson, and I'll provide some more evidence of that here in a minute. But this is a passage out of the book, and this is a complicated and subject that a lot of research has been done over the last couple of decades, which corroborates the ethnographic record, meaning the record that anthropologists have developed through their work in doing interviews with Native people about their practices. So the image in the upper right-hand corner is a scanning electron microscope image of pollen grains. And when you start to analyze pollen cores from mud in various locations in the West, these pollen records can go back actually millions of years, but I'm going to focus on this post-glacial record. And the post-glacial record is after the Ice Age, after the retreat of the glaciers, and what it shows is that during the Holocene, there were significant shifts in vegetation patterns in the West, even here in South Sound, the South Puget Sound. Early on, and this isn't surprising, vegetation was more like vegetation that you would find at higher elevation. So it was colder, and species that now have retreated up to higher elevation where the climate is more akin to what it was like here as the glaciers were retreating, were growing at these lower elevations. As it started to become warmer and drier, those species drop out of the pollen record, and what starts to appear are oaks, chinquapin, a relative of oaks, and other species that are xerophytic. So xerophytic means plants that prefer dry and warm conditions. Then during the late Holocene period, about 4,500 years ago, the climate started to become cooler and wetter again. And what happened is that Douglas fir and other conifers started to reassert themselves and invade these grasslands and oak woodlands. And at that point, depending on the location in North America, Native tribes started to burn to remove this coniferous competition to favor oaks, which they had become dependent on. In historic images, you can see this, and part of what they were doing is to completely reshape the trees that they were dependent on. So if you're familiar with tan oak, you may know that it grows, it's very shade tolerant, and it can grow in the understory of old growth redwoods. And when it does, its shape is very, very different. It has a long bowl, meaning a trunk with no branches, which means that it's very adaptable to using as a lumber source. However, in those kind of situations where it's heavily shaded, it does not produce a lot of acorns. And because Native people were interested in the acorns, they burned to get rid of the conifers and allow the tree to take a very, very different shape, like this one here in this image from Jepson Silva of California, published in 1910. And again, he repeats and goes into more detail about the way in which Native people were using fire as a management tool. And what you can see in this image, you can actually see a deer browse line or cattle browse line as well. Probably about 4.5 feet high where that straight line starts. But the overall shape is very dense. It's short. It doesn't have a long bowl. It doesn't have a long trunk without any branches. And the canopy is very dense. When the trees are allowed to do this, they produce a lot of acorns, which is exactly what Native people were interested in favoring. In the ethnographic record, also, it repeatedly comes up not only that these trees were manipulated with fire, but that specifically fire was a tool to control diseases and pests. When white settlement occurred, pretty quickly fire suppression started to happen. I mean, Native people were displaced. There was actual genocide of Native people in California that's well documented. And in other places, people were moved long distances, often away from plants that they had typically depended on. And the regular burning, in some cases annually, started to end. And there was an overlap period where people of different cultures were coexisting, a lot of conflict, a lot of violence, and you start to see in laws the appearance of limitations, specific limitations on burning. So as this fire suppression begins, pretty quickly, so again, here's Willis and Jepson in 1910, pointing out that already the vegetation is shifting, that Douglas fir and other conifers are moving into these balds or prairie balds or prairie openings that are associated with these oaks. And we have similar systems here in Washington. You know, different species, the Oregon white oak or Gary oak, that are associated with the prairies here in Washington. So similar kinds of histories in terms of manipulation. And in fact, here's an image of one of the local prairies here on the left. This is an image from Glacial Heritage County Park showing the camas bulbs, which are one of the geophytes, one of the plants that produce an underground structure, a bulb that's used as a food source. And so these prairie systems, along with the associated oaks, were super important food-producing areas in a zone in North America that is left to its own devices, often dominated by conifers that have less food value. Also, these prairies provided important habitat for animal species that Native people depended on, like elk, deer, and so on. When you start to examine the soil in areas, many areas in the West that are now dominated by conifer trees because of fire suppression, you will actually find phytoliths. Phyto means plant, lith means stone, and what this is a reference to is these silica deposits that form in the cell walls of grass species that actually can be recognizable often to genus by the shape of the phytolith. And so this scanning electron microscope image to the left is one of those dumbbell, it's called a dumbbell phytolith. And you can see it in the image of the light microscope image on the right-hand side embedded in the tissue of the grass. And so what this tells us is that areas that are now dominated by conifers, many of these areas were in the past dominated by grass that no longer grows there because it's too shady. So what we've been doing is examining, and to use Revkin's words, the evidence for and the meaning of the Anthropocene, the proposed epoch of Earth history that has been begun with the rise of the human species as a global, potent biogeophysical force capable of leaving a durable imprint in the geologic record. And these microfossils are part of that durable imprint in the geologic record. So, I want to shift gears to another aspect of tan oak, and so we're shifting to this topic of its bark. And I think what's so important about this chapter in the story of tan oak, this case study, is that tanning is often an early industry in areas that are becoming industrialized. In fact, even Paris had tanneries in its early industrialization. It is a very unpopular industry because it stinks. And so it doesn't last usually very long in dense urban environments. People want it to move somewhere else. It involves, in using vegetable tan, it involves soaking hides with remnants of animal flesh still stuck on the hides in vats of oak decoction, which, if you're an herbalist, you know means a water solution derived from a plant material, often bark or root, that is boiled to bring out the qualities of the plant material into the liquid. And what they were using is the tannic acid. The tannic acid was critical to producing very high quality, heavy leather in a time that was, in a time without plastic. A lot of things that are made now with plastic were made with leather. In fact, leather literally ran the cogs through the leather belts of industry, of machinery that depended on belts. And of course, the dependence on horses as a primary mode of transportation also meant that heavy leather was highly desirable. And so tan oak quickly became a very important commodity in the industrialization of California and Southwest Oregon, where tan oak extends its range. And again, we see this transformation of a cultural landscape that was created by Native people through burning to be a different kind of cultural landscape that favored tanning. And tan oak was, you can see from this map, from the book, how pervasive this industry was in California that overlapped with the distribution of tan oak. Again, Willis Lynn Jepson speaks out in defense of tan oak, but for naught. He was very troubled by the amount of waste that was occurring, because what was happening is tan oak trees were being cut down, the bark was stripped, and much of the wood was left to rot on the ground. And there was no incentive to conserve. There were people advocating for conservation, but it was, people were up against some realities, technological realities, like the steam donkey. So if you thought that clear cutting is a recent phenomenon, steam donkey, what's going on here is that the log would be attached to this steam donkey that's featured in the center of the photograph, and then it would pull the log to the steam donkey. So anything between, we're talking a large log. So anything between the steam donkey and the log is toast. There is no point in saving little tan oak trees. So what they were doing in coast redwood forests, and particularly alluvial flats in Northern California in particular, is going in and extracting the old growth redwood, which was highly valuable. But before they did, they would harvest the tan oak. And there was no reason to save anything, because the landscape was going to look like this at the end of it. They would really liquidate the resource. And to get a sense of what we're talking about, here, this image shows a loading dock of all the bark that had been stripped that was getting ready to be sent to San Francisco, because many of the tanneries were located in San Francisco. And in this image, being a Californian, being from the Bay Area, this always cracks me up, because I love how Chicago has been crossed out and Benicia has been replaced, because Benicia is not Chicago. And if you know the Bay Area, you know that. The other funny thing about this image is that in this industrial complex, so when we interpret images like this, we have to consider, what did the image mean at the time? A lot of people who are sympathetic to environmental problems today wouldn't see a smokestack, for example, as a positive thing. But in this image, it's actually seen as it was intended to be read as something positive. There was an indication that California was becoming industrialized. It was becoming efficient in its use of natural resources. And indeed, cultured, because in the center of this industrial complex, there's even a 4-square garden with a fountain in the center, which is a reference to a Persian garden design. So there's a lot going on in this image. Yet another image that I think really deserves dissecting and analyzing in some detail is this allegorical image that shows an Englishman by the name of John Vanderplank, who was advocating for the use of an Australian tree called wattle trees. This is a kind of acacia. And black acacia was seen as a superior species to tan oak for the production of tan bark, because it is fast growing and it can be grown in plantations. And so this was another reason why people who advocated for conservation of tan oak were up against some stiff competition, if you will, in terms of in the market of ideas. The notion that plantation economies in South Africa could produce a tan bark source, a vegetable tannin source, more efficiently using a different kind of labor source. So in fact, here we see a lot going on. We see not only Vanderplank handing black wattle seeds to a faceless white settler who's an Afrikaner who's actually Dutch in origin. She's symbolically representing the person who will nurture these seeds to fruition, which is, of course, a very gendered kind of worldview. And the man standing next to her is to enforce, through violence if need be, this new social order that the two of them are constructing with the source of this individual Vanderplank through the establishment of a new plantation economy. And the person who will benefit most from this transformation is their son, who is pictured without any shoes. But his future will depend on black wattle, which he is leaning against, which will result in him being unyoked. The yoke to the right of Vanderplank has been removed, using the tool to undo a yoke, which is at the feet of this young boy. His material success in the future will depend on the labor of Africans, who is represented by the person just above him, right here. So this kind of sums up a whole kind of world view about how to reorganize the world in a way that allows social mobility. I think it's interesting in the case study of tan oak that there were people celebrating these old world, meaning European, practices of using oak bark to process high quality leather. And in fact, the last tannery on the West Coast didn't close until just recently, 2001. They were in business for over 100 years. And they had to eventually adopt use of chromium salts, which are the chromium salts are obtained through unsustainable practices, e.g. open pit mining. And unlike the sustainable practice of using vegetable tannin for tanning leather, these chromium salts are much more efficient, and you can tan leather much more quickly. And so many people were displaced, workers were displaced by this global competition from other regions of production that could exploit their labor and depend on exploitive environmental practices like use of non-sustainable chromium salts. So I want to now shift to wood, and again we see kind of a repeat here. Despite the fact that tan oak wood can be used for many, many things, including flooring and furniture, there is really a disincentive to process hardwoods in the West because it requires more skilled labor, and in a region where labor conflicts, of course, erupted into violence on the West Coast in the 1800s and into the 1900s, depending on skilled laborers created a political landscape that made unionization easier for laborers. And so people who were industrializing weren't particularly interested in that. Also, old-growth conifers represent a significantly greater profit margin. This, however, is not the case with second or third growth conifers, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So when you are faced with large trees like this is a coast redwood log, there's not a lot of incentive to process these more difficult trees that aren't as straight, their tissue is more complicated. On a cellular level, there's more different types of cells in a hardwood species, in an angiosperm, a flowering tree, than there are in a conifer. And so conifers lend themselves to wood production much more easily. The loss rates are much lower. You don't have the kind of drying problems that you have with hardwoods that require skilled labor to address. And so what really happened is that hardwood production in North America became centered in the eastern U.S., while conifer production, softwood production, became centered in the West around these species like the coast redwood and the Douglas fir. There's an important difference, though, between Douglas fir and coast redwood. Douglas fir does not stump sprout. So when you start to shift to a dependency on Douglas fir, and in fact create plantations of Douglas fir, which allows for more mechanized production, you create a situation where fire suppression is critical because you have these young forests that are more vulnerable, but you also have the problem that these trees, Douglas fir, don't stump sprout, and so tan oak becomes a weed. During World War II, rather, the extraction of lumber became amplified for the war effort, and then after World War II with the development of suburbs in North America to support the baby boom, really. And that dimensional lumber was coming from these highly productive forests. Much of it was coming from highly productive forests like these Northern California and southwestern Oregon forests. And they started to move more and more into these drier, steeper slopes because they had the technology, partly because of technologies that were developed for the use in war, like tracked vehicles. And that allowed for greater access to these tougher sites to log. And in the process, what happened is that the Douglas fir were then removed, and suddenly tan oak, which is very shade tolerant, exploded. It can grow from adventitious buds at the base of the tree and take over, really. One of its other common names is sovereign oak, meaning that it can hold sovereignty over the land for quite a long time. And as a result, this takes these forests out of production and impacts short-term economic objectives, goals. And so Oregon State University, along with which has a forestry program, among others, started to focus in the 1950s rather, on the use of herbicides to do a competitive release. So this is really transplanting the notion of trees as crop and manipulating forests as you would a agricultural system, and herbicides become a way to do chemical weeding. And initially, they were spraying it aerially. To say these were selective herbicides is generous. They targeted angiosperms. Well, if you know anything about flowering plants, also known as angiosperms, it's the largest group of plants on the planet. So conifers are affected, can be affected, but not as much. And so by spraying these aerially, it allowed them to release the conifers from the competition of tan oak and other hardwood species like big leaf maple, alders, and so on. From this image, you can see that did not go over well in Northern California and in parts of southern Oregon, where a lot of people who were trying to escape the military-industrial complex in urban areas like San Francisco had bought up cut-over land, so logged land in Northern California, and in some cases were engaging in the black market of marijuana, but also trying to create a back-to-land settlement that was based on subsistence farming. And so instead, they realized that they had entered into this region that was heavily manipulated with support from the Forest Service to favor conifers, using herbicides that these back-to-land settlers, along with native people, argued were poisoning them, poisoning their water, affecting pregnant women in particular, causing miscarriages, and so on. And so a debate that continues today in these zones began, and aerial spraying is very rare now, but direct spraying of herbicides on cut trees continues. There's also a practice called hack and squirt, where they take a hatchet and make a big wound on the trunk of a tan oak tree and then spray it with glyphosate or another herbicide. So needless to say, it didn't go over well with native people as well. And I love this quote from James Jacobs' book, The Scientific Revolution. If you're going to read one book on the scientific revolution, this is it. It's short, and it's just a fabulous book. Truth is relative to culture. That what one people takes for good, beautiful, and true may be thought as the reverse by another. So here, kish kale, the beautiful tree, is being killed by another group of people that see it as a weed and a problem and a trash tree. The political fallout of this practice has been significant and continues to shape land use practices in Northern California and Southwest Oregon. One of the things that's happening now is manual removal of tan oak, and the chipped wood is then used for a biofuel, which, if you are someone who values this plant as a totem food plant, to have these trees chopped up into tiny little pieces and sold for $250 a ton is an insult, to say the least. So there's really significant competing cultural values here that have very real ramifications in terms of what we're dealing with now, which is this plague called Phytophthora ramorum. And what is happening in California is really tree die-offs. In Marin County and Sonoma County, mature tan oak trees have pretty much dropped out of these systems. The old trees are the most vulnerable, and in some regions in the central coast of California, like the Big Sur area, there's been 100% mortality of these trees above ground. They will stump sprout back up, not stump sprout, they'll come back from their adventitious buds with coppice growth, but like American chestnut, which is essentially functionally extinct in North America, they never get old enough to produce nuts again, because the pathogen eventually hammers them, kills them down to the ground. And we don't really know how long they're going to be able to keep that up, being killed down to the ground, coming back up, killed back down to the ground. Also, this is creating a significant fire hazard. So you can see in the right image sort of the landscape scale of this die-off that's happening in the regions where P. ramorum has spread. I made a mention of chestnut blight in my reference to American chestnut, which is a relative of tan oak. And in the early 1900s, there was actually laws like the Plant Quarantine Act, which was established to try and prevent this kind of thing from happening again. However, due to free trade, those laws have been modified, and we've gone from a region in the world that has had historically really good control, or control is not the right word, but managed the threat of the introduction of plant pathogens fairly well relative to other regions in the world, to an area that we are now experiencing many, many introductions of plant diseases that have the capacity and indeed are already transforming our forests. I really think that this particular plant pathologist, Clive Brazier, says it well when he says movement of plants and plant products between biogeographical zones is now generally accepted to be the primary mode of introduction of exotic pathogens and pests. So, and this is actually a complicated topic that, if you're interested, I encourage you to explore more in the book, but this widespread introduction of non-native invasive species, including plant pathogens, has really accelerated due to free trade. And significant horticultural species groups like genera, like rhododendron, are in this case involved. If you look at the list of plants that are hosts for this disease, that help to spread the disease into new locations, it is kind of a list of a lot of the top horticulture species that people love to have in their gardens: rhododendrons, camellias, the whole genus Vaccinium, which also includes blueberries, cranberries, huckleberries. And these plants can be purchased at nurseries and then planted in people's gardens, which in particular places that are at that inter-urban-rural interface can then be a jumping off point for the pathogen into these systems. And there's been a lot of effort to try and prevent spread. However, it's not been very effective. The disease appeared in the mid-1990s, and since then, it has spread through the greater San Francisco Bay Area and now has appeared in Humboldt County, which you can see from this diagram is really the heartland of tan oak and many of the other species that serve as hosts for for the pathogen P. ramorum. So the reason why tan oak is so important to the spread of the disease is that it, along with California bay, is the only one species. Those two species are the only ones that actually sporulate. They produce the spores that help spread the disease. And when you look at the computer models for what the future holds for us, plant pathologists predict an exponential rate of growth, and that we're really perched for a significant spread of P. ramorum in these counties like Humboldt County and Mendocino County, where tribes still depend on this plant as a food plant. So we are, again, seeing through this case study the way in which climate change factors into the impact of humans on natural ecosystems. With climate change, you get more erratic weather patterns, and one of the things that can happen is wetter, warmer springs. This is a water mold, P. ramorum is, and it loves wetter, warmer. And so what is expected to happen is, although droughts will help knock it back, when wet, warm springs occur, the pathogen will come back with a vengeance. So, as I said, this is still a very important indigenous food source. Here we see the kind of scale of gathering that still continues today, along with California bay nuts, also a species threatened by an invasive non-native plant disease. And here on the right, Native women who are ceremonially preparing tan oak for an important event in the calendar called the Jump Dance. These are Hupa tribal members. I think that Winnie Marshall may have been prophetic when she said in 1984 that everyone might have to rely on native foods to survive. So if we consider the sort of fragility of our settlement, so to speak, of Euro-American settlement on the west coast of North America, which depends on a lot of plants that are native to Europe and Asia, that depend on irrigation in a Mediterranean climate. Climate change poses very significant threats to important food plants like corn and wheat. And in fact, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change on these important staple food plants. And so it may be that we need to consider the value of indigenous food plants that are better adapted to the environments in which we live. And I think there's some hopeful signs in terms of the growing acceptance of different kinds of foods that maybe people aren't initially familiar with, like quinoa and baobab tree and so on and so forth. So I want to end by talking about the partnerships that are emerging in response to this environmental catastrophe, really, for tan oak. As I mentioned, prairie oak ecosystems in the West in general benefit from positive human intervention, human disturbance that enhances biodiversity and ecosystem function. And I think that it's a good model for how sensitive relationships with plants can, through this mutual aid, where humans are aiding plants to thrive that benefit them in a partnership, can be important models for us today, and also collaborations among people, different kinds of people. So one of the things that's happening in response to the tan oak crisis is a lot of community-based interventions. So, of course, people who live in Northern California are well aware that their property is at stake with the threat of catastrophic wildfires. And through nonprofit organizations like the Fire Safe Councils or with the support of the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, they are already preparing for the threat of these catastrophic fires by reducing fuel loads and using prescribed burning to reduce conifer competition for tan oaks, but also to reduce fuel loads to reduce that threat of fire. A lot of communities are also engaged in citizen science with the support of university researchers like plant pathologists from UC Berkeley, Matteo Garbaletto, and from University of California, Davis, Dave Rizzo, who help communities, including tribal communities, to learn how to monitor for P. ramorum. Early detection is very important, and there are some basic monitoring practices that can be adopted by non-scientists, formally trained scientists, to monitor for the appearance of the disease, of the pathogen. Also, many tribes are extremely concerned about the widespread occurrence of diabetes in their communities and are attempting to address that significant problem by reconsidering and readopting indigenous food plants and considering the ways in which such adoption can improve their food security. And that work on the part of the tribes is being supported by the University of California, Berkeley through their herbaria, as well as the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Also, the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service both have been doing underburning in culturally significant old growth stands of Douglas fir with the partnership of tribes in the area to improve the quality of these important cultural landscapes using traditional ecological knowledge to do so with the guidance of elders from the tribes. So here's a couple of images. This is an image from Northern California of a prescribed burn that was done in the understory. You can see, through skillful use of fire, you can keep it from going up into the crown. You can keep it on the ground, which is exactly what Native people were doing prior to white settlement. Here's an image of a tribal member from the Yurok tribe working with a plant pathologist from UC Davis. And what they're actually studying is the appearance of genetic resistance on the part of tan oak to P. ramorum. And there are many other forms of citizen science that are connected to really responding to, through partnerships built on mutual aid, that are a direct response to this current crisis for tan oak. So in summary, I want to just say, these are my key points in a nutshell, or an acorn shell. These are my key points. Complex problems need to be put in historical context. I think in this case study that I've presented, we can see that humans have in the past responded to climate change in ways that have actually resulted in greater biodiversity, improved ecosystem function. And so it's not a given that we're completely incapable of positive response. And I also think that this tan oak case study provides a good example of how we need to really question this pervasive attitude that humans are inherently bad for nature. Without us challenging that, I think it will be very difficult for us to respond to the multitudinous environmental challenges that face us today, as will a reliance on science and technology alone. In the case of tan oak, we have no way of responding to this outbreak of P. ramorum. We have no effective ways of controlling the disease. Fire can be used to reduce the threat and help to contain the spread, but that we have no silver bullets. There are no pesticides that control the disease. So, and when you understand these kinds of environmental problems in a historical context, you can see how important it is to understand the ways in which cultural values contribute to these problems, and that unpacking those values will be critical to building partnerships so that we can meaningfully respond to environmental problems. So I want to end with a quote from someone who I rarely agree with, but I completely agree with Garrett Hardin when he says, ecology's most profound insights call for far-reaching modifications of long-standing social arrangements. And with that, a long list, and there are many others, of institutions and people who I'd like to thank, and I'd like to open it up for questions